The autumn leaves danced outside the tall windows of the Whitmore Dance Academy as 8-year-old Eleanor adjusted her white tutu one final time. The September air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying roses through the drafty corridors of the Victorian mansion that had housed 3 generations of Whitmore dancers. "Eleanor, darling, keep your chin up. Remember, you are a swan, not a duckling," called Margaret Whitmore from across the polished hardwood floor. The woman's voice echoed through the grand ballroom that served as the main studio, her words sharp despite the endearing tone. Eleanor's identical twin sister, Evelyn, stood beside her in perfect mirror position, their movements synchronized as if controlled by invisible strings. The girls had been performing together since they could walk, their mother often remarking that they shared not just a face, but a soul. "Yes, mother," both girls replied in unison, their voices creating an eerie harmony that seemed to linger in the air longer than it should have. The photographer, Mr. Harold Grisham, adjusted his large format camera on its wooden tripod. He was a nervous man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that constantly slipped down his nose. He had been commissioned by the local newspaper to document the Whitmore twins for an upcoming article about child prodigies in Connecticut. "Now, girls, I want you to hold your arabesque position. This will be for the front page, so we need perfection," Mr. Grisham said, his voice slightly muffled as he ducked under the black cloth behind his camera. The ballroom fell silent, except for the grandfather clock ticking ominously in the corner. Eleanor felt a strange chill run down her spine, something she had been experiencing more frequently in recent weeks. The sensation was always accompanied by the feeling that someone was watching her, though when she turned to look, she found only empty doorways and shadowed corners. Eleanor lifted her leg behind her, extending her arms in the graceful swan position they had practiced thousands of times. Beside her, Evelyn mirrored the movement perfectly, but as Eleanor held the pose, she noticed something odd in her peripheral vision. Her sister's reflection in the tall mirror that lined the wall seemed different somehow. "Hold steady now," Mr. Grisham called out, his head still buried under the camera cloth. Eleanor tried to focus on maintaining her balance, but the feeling of being watched intensified. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, and she could have sworn she heard the faint sound of children laughing somewhere deep within the walls of the old house. "Mother?" Eleanor whispered, still holding her pose. "Do you hear that?" Margaret Whitmore frowned, tilting her head to listen. "Hear what, dear?" The laughter grew slightly louder, and Eleanor saw Evelyn's eyes widen with recognition. Her twin had heard it too. "The children in the walls," Evelyn said softly, her voice taking on an odd, distant quality that Eleanor had never heard before. Mr. Grisham emerged from behind his camera, looking concerned. "Is everything all right? You girls need to stay still for the exposure." Margaret approached her daughters, her face pale. "What children, Evelyn? There are no other children here." But even as she spoke, the sound of laughter echoed more clearly through the ballroom, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. It was the laughter of children, but there was something wrong with it, something that made Eleanor's skin crawl and her perfectly maintained pose begin to tremble. The grandfather clock chimed 4 times, its deep tones drowning out the mysterious laughter. When the echoes faded, an unnatural silence fell over the room. "Let's take the photograph now," Eleanor said quickly, desperate to break the oppressive quiet. Mr. Grisham nodded nervously and disappeared back under his camera cloth. "On my count then. 1, 2, 3. The flash powder exploded in a brilliant burst of light, temporarily blinding everyone in the room. In that moment of searing brightness, Eleanor felt something impossible happen, as if the world had shifted slightly, as if reality had flickered like a candle flame in the wind. When her vision cleared, everything appeared normal. Evelyn stood beside her, smiling sweetly. Margaret clapped her hands together approvingly. Mr. Grisham was already preparing his equipment for the next shot, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed in that moment of blinding light, something that would soon turn their perfect world into a nightmare beyond imagination. 3 days later, Mr. Harold Grisham stood in his cramped darkroom above his photography shop on Main Street, staring at the developed photograph with trembling hands. The red safe light cast everything in an ominous glow, but what he saw in the image before him defied all logical explanation. Eleanor Whitmore stood in perfect arabesque position, her face serene and beautiful, exactly as he remembered. But her twin sister Evelyn. Evelyn's head was turned completely backwards, a full 180 degrees, her dark eyes staring directly into the camera lens with an expression that made Grisham's blood run cold. "This can't be right," he muttered, adjusting his spectacles with shaking fingers. He held the photograph closer to the dim light, examining every detail. There was no evidence of double exposure, no signs of tampering. The image was crystal clear, technically perfect, and absolutely impossible. He remembered the session vividly. Both girls had faced forward throughout the entire shoot. He was certain of it. Yet here was undeniable proof that something had gone terribly wrong in that moment when the flash powder ignited. Grisham set the photograph down on his work table and reached for his magnifying glass. Under closer inspection, Evelyn's backwards-facing expression became even more disturbing. Her mouth was set in a slight smile, but her eyes held a knowledge that no 8-year-old should possess. They seemed ancient, cold, and utterly malevolent. A sudden knock at his shop door below made him jump, nearly knocking over his chemical trays. Grisham glanced at the clock. It was well past 9 in the evening. Who would be calling at this hour? He carefully placed the photograph in his filing cabinet and made his way downstairs, his footsteps echoing in the empty shop. Through the glass door, he could see a woman's silhouette against the street lamp. "We're closed," he called out, but the knocking continued, more insistent now. "Mr. Grisham, it's Margaret Whitmore. I need to speak with you about the photographs." Grisham's heart began racing. He unlocked the door with trembling fingers, and Margaret Whitmore stepped inside, her face pale and drawn. She was still beautiful at 35, but tonight she looked as though she had aged years in just 3 days. "Mrs. Whitmore, I wasn't expecting you so late. The photographs aren't quite ready yet." "Mr. Grisham," she interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper, "something's wrong with Evelyn. Ever since that photography session, she's been different." Grisham felt his throat constrict. Different how? Margaret wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to ward off a chill. "She speaks to people who aren't there. She knows things she couldn't possibly know. And yesterday, I found her in the ballroom in the middle of the night, dancing with something I couldn't see. Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps you should speak with a doctor. It's not medical, Mr. Grisham. It's something else, something connected to that house." My grandmother used to tell stories about other twins generations ago, twins who died in that ballroom under mysterious circumstances. Grisham's hands began to sweat. He thought of the impossible photograph locked away upstairs. What kind of stories? "She said the house remembers, that it holds onto the souls of children who died there, especially twins. She said they try to come back, to find new vessels to inhabit." Margaret's voice broke slightly. "I thought they were just old wives' tales, but now—" A long moment of silence stretched between them. Finally, Grisham made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think you should see something." He led her upstairs to his darkroom, his heart pounding with each step. Under the red light, he retrieved the photograph from his filing cabinet and handed it to her with shaking hands. Margaret's scream pierced the night air like a knife. The photograph fluttered to the floor as she stumbled backward, her hands flying to her mouth in horror. "That's impossible," she gasped. "She was facing forward. I was watching her the entire time." Grisham picked up the photograph, staring once more at Evelyn's impossibly twisted form. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think your daughter may be in terrible danger, and I'm afraid this photograph is just the beginning." Outside, the autumn wind began to howl through the empty streets of Millbrook, carrying with it the faint sound of children's laughter. The same laughter Eleanor and Evelyn had heard 3 days earlier in the ballroom of the Whitmore estate. Eleanor woke to the sound of music drifting through the walls of the Whitmore mansion. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, its deep tones reverberating through the old house like a funeral bell. She lay still in her narrow bed, listening to the haunting melody that seemed to come from the ballroom directly below her bedroom. It was a waltz, played on what sounded like an old music box, the notes slightly off-key and distorted by age. Eleanor recognized the tune. It was the same piece her great-grandmother's music box had played, the one that had been lost in a fire decades before Eleanor was born. She turned to wake her sister in the bed across the room, but Evelyn's covers were thrown back and the bed was empty. The window was open, allowing the cold October air to billow the white curtains like ghostly dancers. "Evelyn," Eleanor whispered, but received no answer. The music grew louder, more insistent, and Eleanor could hear the soft shuffle of ballet slippers against hardwood. Someone was dancing in the ballroom at midnight, and she had a terrible suspicion she knew who it was. Eleanor slipped from her bed, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. She crept to her bedroom door and opened it slowly, peering out into the darkened hallway. The music was definitely coming from downstairs, accompanied now by the sound of multiple dancers moving in perfect synchronization. As she made her way down the grand staircase, each step creaking softly under her weight. Eleanor noticed that the portraits lining the walls seemed different somehow. The painted eyes of her ancestors appeared to be watching her, following her descent with expressions of warning, or perhaps invitation. She couldn't tell which. The ballroom doors stood ajar, spilling pale moonlight into the hallway. Eleanor approached carefully, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the crack between the doors, she could see figures moving in the silvery light. Eleanor pushed the door open wider and gasped. Evelyn stood in the center of the ballroom, but she was not alone. Around her danced the translucent figures of other children, all of them twins, all of them wearing the same white tutus and ballet slippers. Their faces were pale and ethereal, their eyes dark hollows in faces that seemed to shift and blur at the edges. Evelyn moved with them in perfect harmony, but there was something wrong with her movements. They were too fluid, too graceful for an 8-year-old child. She danced as if she had been practicing for decades, her technique flawless and otherworldly. "Evelyn," Eleanor called softly, but her sister didn't respond. The ghostly dancers continued their waltz, spinning and leaping with impossible grace. Eleanor noticed that they all bore a striking resemblance to herself and Evelyn, the same dark hair, the same delicate features, the same haunted eyes. Generations of Whitmore twins, she realized with growing horror. As Eleanor watched, transfixed, one of the spectral dancers turned toward her. It was a girl who looked exactly like Eleanor, but her neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, her head tilted to one side as if it had been broken. "Join us, sister," the ghost whispered, her voice like wind through autumn leaves. "The dance is eternal here. We've been waiting so long for you to complete our circle." Eleanor felt an almost irresistible urge to step into the ballroom, to take her place among the dancing spirits. Her feet began to move of their own accord, carrying her across the threshold. But as she took her first step into the moonlit room, Evelyn suddenly stopped dancing and turned to face her. Eleanor's blood froze in her veins. Her twin sister's head was tilted at the same impossible angle as the broken-necked ghost. And when Evelyn smiled, it was with the cold, ancient knowledge Eleanor had glimpsed in her eyes during the photography session. "Come dance with us, Eleanor," Evelyn said, but her voice was layered with others, the voices of all the dead twins who had danced in this room before. "Mother and father are already asleep. They'll never know we're gone." Eleanor backed away from the doorway, shaking her head frantically. "You're not Evelyn. What have you done with my sister?" The ghostly dancers laughed in unison, their mirth echoing through the ballroom like broken glass. Evelyn's twisted smile widened. "I am Evelyn. I am Charlotte. I am Grace. I am Mary. I am all of us. And soon, you will be too." She extended her hand toward Eleanor. The photograph was just the beginning. "Soon, we'll be together forever." Eleanor turned and ran, her bare feet slapping against the marble floor as she raced up the staircase. Behind her, the music grew discordant and wild, the laughter of the dead twins following her through the darkened hallways of the Whitmore mansion. Eleanor burst into her parents' bedroom without knocking, her nightgown damp with perspiration and her face streaked with tears. Margaret and Charles Whitmore sat up immediately, alarmed by their daughter's panicked state. "Eleanor, what's wrong, sweetheart?" Margaret reached for her daughter, pulling her onto the four-poster bed. "It's Evelyn," Eleanor sobbed. "She's downstairs dancing with dead children. They all look like us, Mother. They want me to join them." Charles Whitmore, a stern man with graying temples, frowned deeply. He exchanged a meaningful glance with his wife before speaking. "Eleanor, you've had a nightmare. Evelyn is in her bed, sleeping—" "No," Eleanor interrupted, grabbing her mother's arm. "Go look. Her bed is empty and the window is open. She's in the ballroom with the ghost twins." Margaret rose from the bed, her silk nightgown rustling as she moved toward the door. "I'll check on her," she said softly, but Charles caught her wrist. "Margaret, no." His voice was heavy with resignation. "It's time she knew the truth." Eleanor looked between her parents, confusion and fear warring in her dark eyes. "What truth?" Charles ran a hand through his thinning hair and seemed to age 10 years before Eleanor's eyes. "The Whitmore family has a curse, Eleanor. It's been passed down for 5 generations, always affecting the twins." Margaret sank back onto the bed, her face pale. "Charles, she's only 8. She's old enough to understand that her life is in danger," Charles said firmly. He turned to Eleanor, his expression grave. "Your great-great-grandmother had twin daughters, Charlotte and Grace. They died in this house in 1847, during a dance recital. Their necks were broken in what appeared to be a terrible accident." Eleanor felt the room spinning around her. "How? No one knows for certain. The official report said they fell during a particularly difficult lift, but there were witnesses who claimed they saw the girls' heads turn completely around before they collapsed. Margaret began to weep silently, her hands pressed to her mouth. Charles continued, his voice steady but haunted. 20 years later, my great-grandmother gave birth to twins, Mary and Elizabeth. They died at age 8, during their first major performance. Same injuries, same mysterious circumstances. Then came my grandmother's twins, Victoria and Violet, 8 years old when they died, both found in the ballroom with their necks twisted at impossible angles. Eleanor's breath came in short gasps. What about your twins, father? Did you have siblings? Charles nodded slowly. My twin brother, William. We made it to 16 before... He paused, swallowing hard. Before the curse claimed him. I was the first to survive, and I thought marrying your mother and moving away might break the pattern, but when you girls were born, both on the same night, both identical, we knew we had to come back to the house, Margaret whispered. The dance academy has always been in the family. We thought if we could control the environment, maybe we could protect you both. Eleanor felt sick to her stomach. But something's already started, hasn't it? That's why Evelyn has been acting strange since the photograph. Charles and Margaret exchanged another loaded glance. The photograph, Charles said quietly. What photograph? Eleanor told them about the session with Mr. Grisham, about the strange sensations she had experienced, about finding Evelyn dancing with ghostly figures just minutes earlier. As she spoke, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and they could all hear the distant sound of music drifting up from the ballroom below. My God, Margaret breathed. It's starting again. Charles stood abruptly, moving to an antique wardrobe in the corner of the room. He pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. This belonged to my grandmother. She documented everything she could discover about the curse before her twins died. He opened the journal, revealing pages of spidery handwriting interspersed with newspaper clippings and old photographs. Eleanor gasped when she saw the images. Twins throughout the decades, all bearing the Whitmore family resemblance, all frozen in dance poses, all with the same haunted expression in their eyes. According to her research, Charles continued, the curse is tied to the ballroom itself. The spirits of the dead twins are trapped here, and every generation they try to claim new vessels. The process begins with a photograph. Something about capturing the soul at the moment of the flash allows the spirits to begin their possession. Margaret stood and walked to the window, staring out at the moonlit grounds. We should have burned this place down years ago. It wouldn't matter, Charles said sadly. The curse follows the bloodline, not just the house. We can't run from what we are. A child's laughter echoed through the mansion, followed by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Eleanor recognized her sister's voice, but it was different now, older, colder, layered with the voices of the dead. Eleanor, Evelyn called from just outside the bedroom door, come play with us. The dance is beginning, and we need our other half to make it complete. The door handle began to turn slowly, and Eleanor saw her parents' faces drain of all color. Whatever was approaching was no longer entirely their daughter, and they all knew that their fight for Evelyn's soul had only just begun. The bedroom door creaked open, and Evelyn stepped inside with movements that were far too graceful for a child her age. Her white nightgown billowed around her, as if moved by invisible winds, and her dark hair framed a face that Eleanor barely recognized as her twins. "Why are you all awake at this hour?" Evelyn asked, tilting her head at an unnatural angle. Her voice carried the musical cadence of multiple children speaking in unison. The living should be sleeping when the dead come out to play. Charles clutched his grandmother's journal tighter, positioning himself between Evelyn and Eleanor. "You're not our daughter," he said, his voice trembling but determined. "I know what you are." Evelyn smiled, and her eyes reflected the moonlight like a cat's. "I am Charlotte Whitmore, who died in 1847 when her partner dropped her during a grand jeté. I am Grace Whitmore, who broke her neck trying to follow her sister into death. I am Mary, Elizabeth, Victoria, and Violet. We are all the Whitmore twins who perished in that ballroom, and now I'm also Evelyn." Margaret pressed her hands to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "Give me back my daughter." "She is still here," the thing wearing Evelyn's face replied, "but she is learning to share her body with her ancestors. Soon, she will understand that this is her destiny, just as Eleanor will learn hers." Eleanor felt an icy tendril of fear creep up her spine as Evelyn's gaze fixed on her. In those familiar dark eyes, she could see layers of consciousness. Other children, other twins, all trapped within her sister's small form. "The photograph was the key," Evelyn continued, stepping closer to the bed. When Mr. Grisham's flash captured my image, it created a doorway between the world of the living and the realm where we've been waiting. Each generation of twins strengthens our connection to this plane of existence. Charles opened his grandmother's journal to a page filled with cramped handwriting and crude drawings. According to this, there might be a way to sever the connection. The original curse was created when the first twins died, but it can be broken if— He paused, his face growing pale as he read the faded text. "If what, Father?" Eleanor asked urgently. "If one twin willingly takes on the full burden of the curse, allowing the other to go free. But the sacrifice of the one who takes on the curse becomes the vessel for all the dead twins, forever." Evelyn laughed, the sound like wind chimes made of bone. "Your grandmother was very wise, Charles. She understood the nature of our prison. We are bound to this family, to this bloodline, until someone chooses to join us permanently." Margaret lunged toward her possessed daughter, but Evelyn moved with inhuman speed, dancing away from her mother's grasp. As she spun, her head twisted around completely, facing backwards while her body continued its ballet position. "Don't you see how beautiful we've made her?" Evelyn asked, her backwards head smiling at the horrified family. "She dances now with the skill of 5 generations of Whitmore twins. She is perfection incarnate." Eleanor watched in horror as her sister's head slowly rotated back to its normal position. The casual way Evelyn performed the impossible movement made Eleanor's stomach churn. "There's something else," Charles said, still reading from the journal. "The curse grows stronger with each generation. The dead twins aren't just possessing the living ones, they're trying to create a permanent bridge between life and death. If both Eleanor and Evelyn fall under their influence, the barriers between worlds will collapse," Evelyn finished, her voice now clearly that of an adult woman speaking through a child's throat. "We will be free to walk among the living again, and death will lose its hold on all who die within these walls." The implications of this revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Not only was she and her sister in danger, but their possession could unleash something far worse upon the world. Outside, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, and lightning began to flash across the October sky. The wind howled around the mansion, rattling the windows and causing the old house to groan and creak like a living thing. "The barrier grows thin," Evelyn observed, moving to the window and pressing her face against the glass. "Can you feel it? The dead are pressing closer to the surface. Soon, this house will be full of spirits, not just the Whitmore twins, but everyone who has ever died here." Eleanor felt something cold brush against her arm and spun around to see a translucent figure standing beside the bed, a young girl in a 1920s dress, her neck bent at a sharp angle. More spirits began materializing throughout the room, filling every corner with the ghostly forms of children who had died in the Whitmore mansion over the decades. The living family huddled together on the bed as the temperature plummeted and their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. Eleanor realized with growing terror that they were running out of time to save Evelyn and to prevent something unspeakable from being unleashed upon the world. The following morning brought no relief from the supernatural terror that had invaded the Whitmore mansion. Eleanor sat at the breakfast table, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate while watching her sister with growing unease. Evelyn appeared normal in the daylight, chattering about dance practice and asking for more orange juice, but Eleanor could see the subtle signs that something was terribly wrong. Evelyn's movements were too precise, her posture too perfect. When she thought no one was looking, she would turn her head at angles that made Eleanor's neck ache just watching. Most disturbing of all were her eyes, which seemed to hold depths of knowledge that no 8-year-old should possess. "Girls, finish your breakfast quickly," Margaret said, her voice strained from lack of sleep. "Mr. Grisham called this morning. He's bringing the photographs by this afternoon, and he says he has something important to discuss with us." Eleanor's fork clattered against her plate. "Do we have to see the pictures?" Charles looked up from his newspaper, his face drawn and haggard. "I'm afraid we must, Eleanor. The photographs may hold the key to understanding what's happening to Evelyn." Evelyn's head turned toward her father with mechanical precision. "I'm perfectly fine, Father. In fact, I've never felt better. The other girls have taught me so much about dancing. Would you like me to show you?" Before anyone could respond, Evelyn rose from her chair and began performing an intricate ballet sequence that would have challenged a professional dancer. Her movements flowed together with impossible grace, her body bending and twisting in ways that seemed to defy anatomical limitations. "Evelyn, stop that immediately," Margaret commanded, but her daughter continued dancing, a serene smile fixed on her face. It was then that Eleanor noticed Evelyn's shadow on the wall behind her. While Evelyn danced alone, her shadow showed multiple figures moving in perfect synchronization, the ghostly twins from the previous night, all dancing together as one. The performance ended abruptly when the doorbell rang. Charles rose to answer it, and moments later, Harold Grisham entered the dining room carrying a leather portfolio. The photographer looked as though he hadn't slept in days, his hair disheveled and his hands trembling as he clutched his camera bag. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, I apologize for the early visit, but what I have to show you cannot wait." His eyes darted nervously to Evelyn, who was now sitting primly in her chair as if nothing had happened. "Perhaps the children should go play while we discuss this." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "Whatever it is, I need to see it too. It's about that photograph, isn't it?" Grisham nodded reluctantly and opened his portfolio, withdrawing several prints. "I've been a photographer for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. The first image is impossible." He placed the photograph on the table, and Eleanor gasped. There she was, standing in perfect arabesque, but Evelyn's image showed her head turned completely around, staring directly at the camera, with eyes that seemed to burn with otherworldly fire. "This is what I developed 3 days ago," Grisham continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But that's not all. Each night since then, I've been compelled to return to my darkroom, and each morning I find new photographs that I didn't take." He placed several more images on the table, each one more disturbing than the last. They showed the ballroom of the Whitmore mansion, but filled with dozens of ghostly children in various states of dance. In each photograph, the number of spirits seemed to increase as if they were gathering strength. "Mr. Grisham," Margaret said softly, "you mentioned having something important to discuss. What haven't you told us?" The photographer's hands shook as he reached into his bag and pulled out an old camera, much different from the modern equipment he had used for their session. "This belonged to my grandfather. He was the photographer who documented the deaths of the Whitmore twins in 1893, Mary and Elizabeth." Charles leaned forward, his interest piqued. "You mean this has happened before with your family?" "My grandfather left detailed notes about his experience. He wrote that after photographing the dead children, he began receiving messages. The spirits would manipulate his photographic chemicals, creating images that showed him glimpses of the past and future. They told him that the curse could only be broken by someone outside the Whitmore bloodline, someone who had witnessed the supernatural manifestation through a camera lens." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of messages?" Grisham reached into his portfolio once more and withdrew a photograph that made everyone at the table recoil in horror. It showed Eleanor and Evelyn as they appeared now, but both of their heads were twisted backwards. Behind them stood an army of ghostly children, all with their necks broken at impossible angles. "This appeared in my darkroom last night," Grisham whispered. "Along with this," he placed a final photograph on the table, an image of the Whitmore mansion engulfed in flames, with ghostly figures streaming from the windows like smoke. Evelyn suddenly began to laugh, a sound that echoed strangely in the dining room. When she spoke, her voice carried the cadence of multiple children speaking in unison. "Harold Grisham, grandson of Thomas Grisham, we remember your grandfather well. He tried to help the twins of 1893, but he was too late. Will you make the same mistake, or will you finally give us what we desire?" The photographer's face went white. "What do you want?" Evelyn's head began to turn slowly, unnaturally, until she was looking directly behind herself, while her body remained facing forward. "We want the living to join the dead, Mr. Grisham. We want the barriers between worlds to fall, and we want Eleanor to complete the circle that has been building for 5 generations." As she spoke, the photographs on the table began to smoke and curl at the edges, as if touched by invisible flames. Eleanor realized with growing terror that they were running out of time, and that their only hope might lie with the frightened photographer who had unknowingly become part of their family's cursed legacy. As the photographs continued to smolder on the dining room table, Charles suddenly remembered something crucial. "The attic," he said urgently, rising from his chair. "My grandmother left more than just her journal. There are other documents, letters, things she hid away before she died." Margaret looked confused. "Charles, you've never mentioned—" "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "After what happened to my brother William, I wanted to forget everything about the curse. But now—" He looked at Evelyn, whose head was still turned backwards, while she smiled that unnatural smile. "Now I have no choice." Harold Grisham gathered his photographs with shaking hands, several of them now bearing scorch marks despite no visible flame. I'm coming with you. My grandfather's notes mentioned that your grandmother had discovered something important before her twins died. Eleanor stood as well, but her father shook his head. Eleanor, you should stay here with your mother and sister. No, Eleanor said firmly. If this is about the curse, if it's about saving Evelyn, then I need to know everything. Evelyn's backwards head tilted curiously. Yes, Eleanor should come. After all, the secrets in the attic concern her just as much as they concern me. The way her possessed sister spoke sent chills down Eleanor's spine, but she followed her father and Mr. Grisham up the mansion's main staircase and through a narrow door that led to the third floor. Margaret stayed behind to watch Evelyn, though Eleanor wondered what good it would do. Whatever was controlling her sister seemed to grow stronger by the hour. The attic was a cramped space filled with decades of accumulated family belongings. Dust motes danced in the pale sunlight that filtered through a single small window, and the air smelled of old wood and mothballs. Charles made his way to an ornate trunk in the far corner, one that Eleanor had never seen opened. Grandmother made me promise never to look through these things unless the curse returned, Charles said, lifting the heavy lid. She said that knowledge could be as dangerous as ignorance when dealing with supernatural forces. Inside the trunk were bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, old photographs, newspaper clippings, and several leather-bound journals. Charles pulled out a letter marked with his grandmother's careful handwriting. For Charles, open only in case of emergency. His hands trembled as he broke the wax seal and unfolded the yellowed paper. As he read, his face grew pale and Harold Grisham leaned closer to peer over his shoulder. "What does it say?" Eleanor asked impatiently. Charles cleared his throat and began to read aloud. "My dear grandson, if you are reading this, then the curse has claimed another generation, and I pray it is not too late to save them. What I am about to tell you was discovered at great cost, for my own twins paid the price for my investigation into our family's dark history." Eleanor felt her heart racing as her father continued reading. The curse did not begin with Charlotte and Grace in 1847, as we have always believed. It began much earlier, in 1823, when this house was first built. The land beneath the mansion was once a burial ground for children who died in a cholera epidemic that swept through Millbrook. When construction began, the workers disturbed the graves, scattering the bones and leaving the spirits of those children restless and angry. Grisham gasped. That explains why other children's spirits appear in the photographs, not just the Whitmore twins. Charles nodded grimly and continued reading. The first Whitmore twins to live in this house, Charlotte and Grace, were sensitive to the supernatural presence. The spirits of the plague children were drawn to them, seeking living vessels to house their displaced souls. But something went wrong during the first possession attempt. Instead of simply taking over the girls' bodies, the spirits became trapped between life and death, unable to move on, but unable to fully return to the living world. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "So every generation of twins becomes another trap for the spirits?" "It's worse than that," Charles said, his voice breaking as he read the next paragraph. "Each failed possession makes the barrier between life and death thinner. The spirits grow stronger, more desperate, and more numerous. My grandmother calculated that by the 6th generation, your generation, Eleanor, the accumulated spiritual energy would be enough to tear a permanent hole between the worlds of the living and the dead." The implications hit Eleanor like a physical blow. If she and Evelyn completed the cycle, they wouldn't just be sacrificing themselves, they would be unleashing every tormented spirit that had ever been trapped in the mansion upon the world. Grisham pulled out his grandfather's old camera, examining it closely. "My grandfather wrote that photography could capture spiritual energy, but he never explained how that might be used to fight the curse." Charles reached deeper into the trunk and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was an antique camera lens wrapped in black cloth. Grandmother left this with specific instructions. She called it a soul lens. Apparently it was blessed by a priest who specialized in exorcisms. She believed that if used properly, it could photograph the spirits directly and somehow bind them permanently to the image, preventing them from possessing the living. "But there's a cost, isn't there?" Eleanor asked, recognizing the pattern of sacrifice that seemed to run through her family's history. Charles nodded sadly. "The photographer who uses the soul lens will be marked by the spirits. They'll never stop hunting him, and eventually—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Footsteps echoed from the stairs below, too light and graceful to belong to Margaret. Evelyn's voice drifted up to them, sweet and innocent, but with an underlying tone that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "Eleanor, father, what are you doing up there? We're having such a wonderful dance lesson down here. All the other children have come to join us. Won't you come see?" Through the attic window, Eleanor could see that the sky had darkened to an unnatural twilight, though it was still mid-afternoon. Storm clouds swirled overhead in patterns that defied meteorology, and she could swear she heard the sound of children's laughter carried on the wind. "The final phase is beginning," Charles said grimly, clutching the soul lens. "We're running out of time." As if summoned by his words, Evelyn appeared at the top of the attic stairs, her movements flowing like water. But she was no longer alone. Behind her stood the translucent figures of dozens of children, all with their heads twisted at impossible angles, all smiling the same cold, ancient smile. "Stay back," Charles commanded, holding the blessed camera lens between himself and the advancing spirits. The ghostly children hesitated, their forms flickering like candle flames in a wind, but Evelyn continued forward with her unnatural, fluid movements. "Father, you're being silly," she said, but her voice contained layers of other children speaking in unison. "We only want Eleanor to join our eternal dance. Once she takes her place with us, the circle will be complete, and we can all rest." Harold Grisham fumbled with his camera equipment, his hands shaking as he tried to attach the soul lens to his grandfather's antique camera. "How do we know this will work?" he whispered urgently. Eleanor pressed herself against the attic wall, watching in horror as more spectral figures materialized around her possessed sister. She could see children from different eras, some in Victorian dress, others in clothing from the 1920s and 1930s. All of them bore the telltale signs of broken necks, their heads tilted at grotesque angles. "The lens has to capture their true forms," Charles said, reading frantically from his grandmother's letter. "But it only works if they're all gathered together, and if the living twin willingly calls them forth." "I won't do it," Eleanor said firmly. "I won't call them." Evelyn laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of bone. "You don't have to call us, sister. We're already here. Look around you." Eleanor glanced around the attic and gasped. The space was now filled with ghostly children, their translucent forms crowding every corner. They reached toward her with pale, grasping hands, their mouths moving in silent pleas or threats. She couldn't tell which. "The barrier is almost gone," Evelyn continued, her backwards head rotating slowly as she spoke. "In a few more minutes, we won't need living vessels at all. We'll be able to walk among the living permanently, and death will lose its meaning in this place." Grisham finally managed to secure the soul lens to his camera. The moment it clicked into place, the lens began to glow with a soft, otherworldly light. "Charles, I think it's ready, but I don't know how to activate it." "The letter says the photographer must speak the names of all the trapped spirits," Charles replied, his voice strained. "But how can we know all their names?" Eleanor felt a sudden, inexplicable understanding wash over her. "They'll tell us," she said quietly. "If I ask them directly, they'll have to answer. It's part of the curse. They can't lie about who they are." "Eleanor, no," her father protested. "If you communicate with them directly, you'll make yourself more vulnerable to possession." "We don't have a choice," Eleanor said, stepping toward her sister and the assembled spirits. "Tell me your names, all of you. I command you as a living Whitmore twin to reveal yourselves." The ghostly children began to speak in unison, their voices creating an eerie harmony that made the attic walls seem to vibrate. "I am Charlotte Whitmore, who died in 1847. I am Grace Whitmore, who followed her sister into death. I am Mary Whitmore, who fell during the grand performance of 1867. I am Elizabeth Whitmore, who could not live without her twin. I am Victoria Whitmore, who danced until her neck snapped in 1887. I am Violet Whitmore, who joined her sister in the eternal waltz." But then other voices joined in, children who were not Whitmore twins. "I am Thomas Fletcher, age 7, who died of cholera in 1823. I am Sarah Mills, age 6, who was buried beneath this house. I am Jonathan Graves, age 9, whose rest was disturbed by the builders." The litany continued. Dozens of names, dozens of children who had died and been trapped in this place for over a century. Grisham frantically scribbled down each name as Eleanor spoke them aloud, repeating what the spirits told her. As the names were recorded, the soul lens grew brighter, casting strange shadows throughout the attic. Eleanor could feel the spiritual energy in the room intensifying, pressing against her consciousness like a physical weight. "Now, Harold," Charles shouted. "Photograph them now while they're all visible." Grisham raised the camera, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely aim. "I can't hold it steady." Evelyn suddenly lunged forward, her movements inhuman in their speed and grace. "You will not banish us," she screamed, but now her voice was clearly that of an adult woman speaking through a child's throat. "We have waited too long, suffered too much." Eleanor acted on instinct, grabbing the camera from Grisham's trembling hands. The moment her fingers touched the blessed lens, she felt a jolt of electrical energy shoot up her arms. The lens wasn't just capturing light, it was drawing in spiritual essence, pulling the ghostly children toward the camera like a supernatural magnet. "Eleanor, don't!" Charles cried. "If you use the lens yourself, the spirits will mark you." But Eleanor was already raising the camera, looking through the viewfinder at the assembled host of dead children. Through the soul lens, she could see them more clearly than ever before, not just as translucent figures, but as the frightened, angry children they had been in life. "I see you," she whispered, her finger poised over the shutter release. "I see all of you, and I'm going to set you free." The ghostly children rushed toward her in a wave of supernatural fury, their forms becoming more solid and threatening as they approached. At the center of the charge was Evelyn, her sister's face twisted with rage and desperation. Eleanor closed her eyes, whispered a prayer, and pressed the shutter release. The flash that erupted from the soul lens was unlike anything any of them had ever seen. Not just light, but something that seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality itself. The ghostly children's screams filled the attic as they were pulled inexorably toward the camera, their forms stretching and distorting as they were drawn into the photograph. When the light faded, Eleanor collapsed to the floor, the camera falling from her nerveless fingers. The attic was silent except for the sound of her labored breathing and her father's anguished cry as he rushed to her side. Evelyn lay crumpled near the stairs, her head finally positioned normally on her shoulders. But whether Eleanor had saved her sister or simply trapped her soul along with the others remained to be seen. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness for 3 days, her body burning with fever, while her mind wandered through landscapes that existed somewhere between dreams and nightmares. In her delirium, she could hear voices calling to her from a great distance, children's voices, pleading and angry, trapped somewhere dark and cold. When she finally opened her eyes, she found herself in her own bed with Dr. Morrison, the town physician, checking her pulse with a worried expression. Her parents sat nearby, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. "Eleanor, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, grasping her daughter's hand. "How do you feel?" Eleanor tried to speak, but her throat felt raw and parched. Dr. Morrison held a glass of water to her lips, allowing her to take small sips. "Where's Evelyn?" she managed to croak. Charles and Margaret exchanged a glance that made Eleanor's heart skip. She's sleeping," her father said carefully. "She hasn't woken up since what happened in the attic." "Is she alive?" Eleanor asked, struggling to sit up despite Dr. Morrison's protests. "Yes, but barely," the doctor replied. "Her vital signs are stable, but she seems to be in some kind of catatonic state. I've never seen anything like it in my 30 years of practice." Eleanor remembered the soul lens, the blinding flash, the sensation of spiritual energy flowing through her body like lightning. The photograph. Did it work? Are the spirits gone? Harold Grisham emerged from the corner of the room, where he had been sitting quietly. His appearance shocked Eleanor. His hair had gone completely white and his hands shook with a constant tremor. "The photograph worked," he said, his voice hollow. "But the cost." He held up the developed image, and Eleanor gasped. The photograph showed the attic filled with ghostly children, but they weren't transparent anymore. They appeared solid, real, trapped forever within the confines of the image. At the center of the photograph was Evelyn, her eyes wide with terror, surrounded by the spectral figures who seemed to be pulling her deeper into the picture. "She's trapped with them," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't save her. I imprisoned her." "That's not entirely true," Charles said softly. He pulled out his grandmother's letter, pointing to a passage Eleanor hadn't heard before. "The soul lens doesn't just trap spirits, Eleanor. It separates them from their anchors in the physical world. Evelyn's body is free from possession, but her soul is temporarily bound with the others until the spiritual energy dissipates." Dr. Morrison frowned. "I don't understand any of this supernatural nonsense, but I can tell you that medically, the child should have died from what you've described. The fact that she's still breathing suggests that some part of her is fighting to return." Grisham set the photograph on the nightstand, and Eleanor noticed that the image seemed to move slightly when she wasn't looking directly at it. "There's something else," he said reluctantly. "Ever since I developed this picture, I've been marked. I can see things that others can't. Dead people, spirits that haven't moved on, they follow me wherever I go. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with her fever. What kind of things? The children who were trapped in your house for so long, they're free now, but they're angry about their century of imprisonment. They blame everyone involved in their captivity, the Whitmore family, and now me for being the one who bound them. He showed Eleanor his hands, which bore strange dark marks that looked like burn scars. These appeared the morning after I developed the photograph. The doctor says they're impossible, burns that go deeper than skin, as if something branded me from the inside. Margaret stood abruptly and walked to the window. Charles, we need to take the girls and leave this place. Whatever Eleanor did, it's not over. We can't leave, Eleanor said firmly, though speaking exhausted her. Not while Evelyn is trapped, and not while Mr. Grisham is being hunted because he helped us. Charles sat on the edge of the bed, his face aged by worry. Eleanor, I don't think there's anything more we can do. According to grandmother's notes, the soul lens was a one-time solution. We used it and now we have to live with the consequences. No, Eleanor said, struggling to her feet despite everyone's protests. There has to be another way. The spirits told me their names, which means they can be reasoned with. Maybe if I go back to the ballroom, if I try to communicate with Evelyn directly. Absolutely not, Dr. Morrison declared. Young lady, you're in no condition to go anywhere. Whatever happened to you has left your nervous system severely compromised. You need rest, not more supernatural encounters. But Eleanor was already moving toward the door, driven by a desperate need to save her sister. As she reached the threshold, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Her shadow on the wall didn't match her movements. It showed her standing perfectly still while around it danced the shadows of dozens of children, all with their heads twisted at impossible angles. Oh no, Grisham whispered, seeing what Eleanor had noticed. The marking isn't just happening to me. Eleanor, look at your hands. Eleanor looked down and saw the same dark burn marks beginning to appear on her palms, the same marks that branded Grisham. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Using the soul lens hadn't just saved them from the curse, it had made her and the photographer permanent targets for every angry spirit that had been trapped in the mansion. The spirits are free from the house, she said quietly, but now they're hunting us, and they won't stop until they have their revenge. Outside, storm clouds gathered once again over the Whitmore mansion, and the sound of children's laughter echoed through the October wind. But this time, it was coming from everywhere at once, surrounding the house like an army preparing for siege. That evening, as darkness settled over Millbrook like a heavy shroud, the true extent of what Eleanor had unleashed became horrifyingly clear. The freed spirits weren't content to simply haunt her and Grisham. They were spreading throughout the town, seeking revenge against anyone connected to their century of imprisonment. Eleanor sat in the parlor, watching through the window as strange lights flickered in the windows of houses throughout the village. The telephone had been ringing constantly, with reports of unexplained phenomena occurring all over town. Children were having nightmares about twisted figures standing at the foot of their beds. Adults were finding their photographs mysteriously altered, showing ghostly children lurking in the backgrounds of family portraits. It's getting worse, Margaret said, hanging up the telephone after yet another disturbing call. That was Mrs. Henderson. She says her daughter Sarah has been talking to an invisible playmate who tells her stories about being buried alive. Charles paced the room frantically, his grandmother's journal clutched in his hands. I've read through everything 3 times. There has to be something we missed, some way to contain the spirits before they hurt innocent people. Harold Grisham sat slumped in an armchair, his face gaunt and his eyes sunken. The burn marks on his hands had spread up his arms, creating intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move when observed closely. They visit me in my darkroom, he said quietly. Every night. They show me what they want to do to the town, to everyone who lives here. They're going to turn Millbrook into a place where the dead walk freely among the living. Eleanor felt the familiar chill that had been plaguing her since using the soul lens. The dark marks on her own hands pulsed with a cold fire, and she could sense the presence of angry spirits growing stronger by the hour. Mr. Grisham, what exactly do they show you? Pictures, he replied, reaching into his camera bag with trembling hands. Pictures that appear in my chemicals without my taking them. He spread several photographs across the coffee table, and everyone in the room recoiled. The images showed Millbrook as it might be in the near future, but it was a nightmare version of their peaceful town. The streets were filled with ghostly children dancing in macabre celebration. Living residents wandered like zombies, their eyes empty and hollow, and at the center of it all stood the Whitmore mansion, now appearing as a massive cathedral of bone and shadow. They're not just seeking revenge, Eleanor realized with growing horror. They want to transform the entire town into their playground, a place where death has no meaning and the living serve the dead. Dr. Morrison, who had stayed to monitor Eleanor's condition, picked up one of the photographs with clinical detachment. These images are impossible. The chemical process alone should prevent such detailed manifestations from appearing without proper exposure. Nothing about this situation follows natural laws, Charles said grimly. We're dealing with forces that exist outside the boundaries of science and reason. A sudden crash from upstairs made everyone freeze. It was followed by the sound of footsteps, light, graceful footsteps that could only belong to one person. "Evelyn?" Eleanor whispered, rising from her chair despite her weakness. The footsteps moved across the ceiling, following the path that led from Evelyn's bedroom to the main staircase. Everyone in the parlor held their breath as they listened to their approach, growing closer with each measured step. Evelyn appeared at the top of the staircase, but she was changed. Her skin was pale as porcelain, and her eyes held a distant, otherworldly quality. She moved with the same inhuman grace that had characterized her during the possession, but there was something different about her now, something that suggested she was fighting an internal battle. "Eleanor," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the high-ceilinged room. "I can see them all. Every spirit that was trapped, every child who died. They're so angry, and they're coming for everyone." "Evelyn, are you yourself?" Margaret asked tentatively. Evelyn's head tilted slightly, but not at the impossible angle it had reached during her possession. "I'm me, but I'm also them. Part of my soul is still trapped in the photograph with the others. I can see what they see, feel what they feel. And Mother, they're planning something terrible." She descended the stairs slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. The photograph didn't destroy them. It gave them focus. Now they know exactly who they want to punish and how they want to do it. They're gathering the other dead from the cemetery, from the old battlefields outside town. By dawn, there will be an army of spirits descending on Millbrook. Eleanor felt her heart sink. There has to be a way to stop them. The soul lens worked once. "The soul lens is broken," Grisham interrupted, pulling the shattered remains of the blessed camera lens from his bag. "I had cracked the moment the photograph was completed. Even if we had another one, I don't think I could survive using it again." Evelyn reached the bottom of the stairs and walked directly to Eleanor. When she took her sister's hands, Eleanor gasped. Evelyn's touch was ice-cold, and through the contact she could suddenly see and feel everything that her twin was experiencing. Hundreds of angry spirits, all focused on a single goal, the dead rising from their graves throughout the county. Living people beginning to lose their connection to life itself as the barrier between worlds continued to weaken. And at the center of it all, the terrible realization that Eleanor's attempt to save her sister had instead doomed their entire town. "There is one way," Evelyn said softly, her voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge, "but it requires a sacrifice that I don't think anyone in this room is prepared to make." Eleanor squeezed her sister's frigid hands, already knowing what Evelyn was going to propose. "Tell us. Someone has to take my place in the photograph. Someone has to willingly enter the spiritual prison and become the anchor that holds all the angry spirits together. Without an anchor in the physical world, they'll eventually dissipate and move on to whatever comes after death." The parlor fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of wind howling around the mansion. Outside, the storm clouds had grown so thick that the afternoon felt like midnight, and strange lights continued to flicker throughout the town as the supernatural invasion spread. Eleanor looked around the room at the faces of everyone she loved, knowing that one of them would have to make the ultimate sacrifice to save Millbrook from becoming a kingdom of the dead. As midnight approached, the supernatural siege of Millbrook reached its climax. Through the windows of the Whitmore mansion, Eleanor could see ghostly figures moving through the streets like a parade of the damned. The freed spirits had indeed gathered reinforcements, spectral soldiers from the Revolutionary War battlefields, plague victims from the old cemetery, and dozens of other restless dead who had been drawn to the town by the weakening barrier between worlds. "We're running out of time," Evelyn said, her voice carrying an otherworldly echo. "I can feel them pressing against my consciousness, trying to use our connection to force their way back into the living world permanently." Eleanor had made her decision, though she hadn't told anyone yet. She stood at the parlor window watching the ghostly army gather in the town square below. The burn marks on her hands had spread up her arms, creating intricate patterns that pulsed with cold fire, and she could feel the spirits calling to her with increasing intensity. "Eleanor," Charles said firmly, I know what you're thinking, and I won't allow it. There has to be another way. There isn't, Eleanor replied, turning from the window. Mr. Grisham is too weak from the marking, and it wouldn't work anyway. He's not a Whitmore twin. Evelyn can't take her own place in the photograph because she's already partially trapped. That leaves me. Margaret began to weep, pressing her hands to her mouth. No, there has to be something else, some other solution. Dr. Morrison had been studying the supernatural photographs with scientific curiosity, but now he looked up with a grim expression. I've been examining these images, and I noticed something disturbing. The spiritual energy seems to be increasing exponentially. If this continues, the barrier between life and death won't just weaken in Millbrook, it could collapse entirely, affecting the entire region. Harold Grisham stood shakily, his camera bag slung over his shoulder. If Eleanor is determined to do this, then we need to act quickly. The process requires another photograph, and the soul lens may be broken, but my grandfather's camera still functions. It won't trap the spirits as effectively, but it might be enough to create a new anchor point. No, Evelyn said suddenly, her head snapping toward the stairs. They're coming. The spirits know what we're planning, and they're going to try to stop us. The temperature in the parlor plummeted, and frost began forming on the windows despite the October warmth outside. The lights flickered as ghostly figures began materializing throughout the room, children with twisted necks, soldiers with gaping wounds, plague victims with hollow eyes. Everyone to the ballroom, Eleanor commanded, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. If we're going to do this, it has to be where the curse began. They moved through the mansion as a group, the spirits following but not yet attacking. Eleanor could sense their hesitation. They wanted to prevent the ritual, but they also needed her alive to serve as their new anchor. It was a delicate balance that wouldn't last long. The ballroom was exactly as Eleanor remembered from that night, when she had found Evelyn dancing with the dead. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, casting everything in an ethereal silver glow. The mirrors along the walls reflected not just the living occupants of the room, but dozens of ghostly figures, standing in every corner. Eleanor, please reconsider, Margaret pleaded. You're only 8 years old. You shouldn't have to make this choice. Someone has to, Eleanor replied, moving to the center of the ballroom. And it has to be someone the spirits trust, someone they believe will honor the commitment. They know I won't try to escape once I'm trapped with them. Evelyn joined her sister in the center of the room, taking Eleanor's hands in her own frozen grip. I'll stay with you as long as I can. When the photograph is taken, when you enter the spiritual prison, you won't be alone. Grisham set up his grandfather's camera with trembling hands, the ancient equipment seeming almost alive in the supernatural atmosphere of the ballroom. The process will be different without the soul lens. More dangerous for Eleanor, but it should still create the anchor effect we need. The ghostly children began to circle the twins, their movements creating a hypnotic dance that seemed to bend reality around them. Eleanor could feel their collective will pressing against her mind, offering her glimpses of what eternity would be like in their company. An endless waltz in a realm where time had no meaning, and pain was just another form of music. I'm ready, Eleanor said, though her voice trembled with fear. Wait, Charles said desperately, pulling out his grandmother's journal one final time. There's one more entry I didn't read before. She wrote it the night before her twins died. He read aloud in a shaking voice. I have discovered that the curse can be broken, but only through an act of perfect love and perfect sacrifice. One twin must willingly take on the burden of both, but if they do so with pure love for their sister and no thought of reward, the spiritual prison will transform from a place of torment into a place of peace. The trapped spirits will find rest, and the one who sacrifices themselves will become their guardian, helping them find their way to whatever comes after death. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. Then it won't be a prison at all. It will be a way station, a place where lost souls can find peace before moving on. The ghostly children stopped their dance, and for the first time since the curse began, Eleanor saw something other than anger in their eyes. She saw hope. I love you, Evelyn, Eleanor said, positioning herself in the center of the ballroom as Grisham prepared to take the final photograph. I love all of you, and I'm going to help you find your way home. The spirits gathered around her, no longer threatening but waiting for someone to finally show them the way to peace. Now, Mr. Grisham, Eleanor said softly, take the picture. The flash exploded through the ballroom like a star going nova, and Eleanor felt herself being pulled into a realm of light and shadow, where time moved differently and love was the only currency that mattered. As consciousness faded, She heard Evelyn's voice calling her name, but it was no longer filled with fear. It was filled with gratitude and hope. 6 months later, spring had returned to Millbrook, Connecticut, bringing with it a sense of renewal that the town hadn't experienced in generations. The supernatural siege that had threatened to transform the peaceful village into a kingdom of the dead was now nothing more than a collection of strange stories that the residents shared in hushed whispers. Evelyn Whitmore sat in the ballroom of the family mansion, no longer the grand dance academy it had once been. Her parents had closed the school after Eleanor's sacrifice, unable to bear the thought of children dancing in the room where their daughter had given her life to save the town. But Evelyn came here every day, drawn by a connection that transcended the boundaries between life and death. "Hello, Eleanor," she whispered to the empty room, though she knew it wasn't truly empty. The response came not as a voice, but as a gentle warmth that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the ballroom. Since the night of the final photograph, Evelyn had been able to sense her sister's presence, not as a ghost or spirit, but as something far more wonderful, a guardian angel who watched over both the living and the dead. Harold Grisham entered the ballroom quietly, his camera bag slung over his shoulder. The burn marks on his arms had faded to faint silver scars, and the constant tremor in his hands had finally stopped. He had become the unofficial chronicler of what the town now called the Night of Lights, documenting the aftermath of Eleanor's sacrifice. "How is she today?" he asked Evelyn, setting up his camera near the window. "Happy," Evelyn replied with certainty. "I can feel that she's happy. And the children she's with, they're happy too. She's teaching them how to let go, how to move on to whatever comes next." Grisham nodded, focusing his lens on a particular spot in the center of the ballroom. Through his camera, he could sometimes catch glimpses of the spiritual realm where Eleanor now resided, not the dark prison that had trapped the angry spirits for so long, but a place of light and healing where lost souls learned to find peace. "The town council wants to turn this place into a memorial," he said as he adjusted his equipment, "a monument to Eleanor's sacrifice." "She wouldn't want that," Evelyn said firmly. "She'd want it to be a place where children could learn and grow and dance, but not until every spirit has found their way home." As if summoned by their conversation, Margaret and Charles Whitmore entered the ballroom. The months since Eleanor's sacrifice had aged them, but there was also a peace in their faces that hadn't been there before. They had lost a daughter, but they had also gained the knowledge that her sacrifice had meaning far beyond what they could have imagined. "Any word from the other families?" Charles asked, referring to the descendants of children who had died during the cholera epidemic that started the curse. "3 more families reported dreams of peaceful farewells," Margaret replied. "The Henderson girl said her invisible friend told her goodbye and that she was going to dance with the angels now." Evelyn smiled, feeling another warm pulse from Eleanor's presence. Each time one of the trapped spirits found peace and moved on, both sisters felt it, Eleanor as the guardian who helped them transition, and Evelyn as the living twin who remained connected to her sister's eternal mission. "How many are left?" Grisham asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Just one," Evelyn said softly. "The first child who died, the one whose anger started the whole curse. Eleanor says he's the most frightened, but she's helping him remember what it felt like to be loved." As she spoke, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the ballroom windows seemed to intensify, forming patterns of light and shadow that almost looked like children dancing. For just a moment, everyone in the room could see them, dozens of young spirits moving in a graceful ballet of farewell, led by a familiar figure whose face radiated love and compassion. Eleanor appeared for just an instant, not as a ghost, but as something infinitely more beautiful. She was older somehow, wiser, her 8-year-old form transformed by her role as guardian of lost souls. She looked directly at her family, her expression conveying everything she couldn't say in words, that she was safe, that she was loved, and that her sacrifice had created something beautiful from centuries of pain. Then the vision faded, leaving only the memory of her smile and the lingering scent of roses that had always been her favorite. "She's almost finished," Evelyn said, tears of joy streaming down her face. "When the last spirit finds peace, Eleanor will have a choice. She can stay as their eternal guardian, or she can move on herself to whatever realm waits beyond this one." "What do you think she'll choose?" Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, listening to something only she could hear. Then she smiled, the same radiant smile that had once belonged to both twins. "She'll choose love," Evelyn said with absolute certainty. "She'll always choose love." Outside, the spring wind carried the sound of children's laughter through the town of Millbrook, not the haunted laughter of trapped spirits, but the joyful sounds of living children at play. The curse was ending, not in violence or despair, but in hope and redemption. And in the ballroom of the Whitmore mansion, where 5 generations of twins had danced their last dance, Eleanor Whitmore continued her eternal waltz, not as a prisoner of the supernatural, but as its most compassionate guardian, helping lost souls find their way home to the light. The photograph that Harold Grisham had taken that night still existed, stored safely in his darkroom, but it no longer showed tortured spirits trapped in darkness. Instead, it captured a moment of perfect love, a young girl surrounded by grateful children, all of them dancing together in a realm where sorrow had been transformed into joy, and death had become nothing more than another kind of beginning.